The knock on my door came at 2 a.m., soft and broken, like someone who had forgotten how to ask for help but still remembered how to reach for it. When I opened it, I found her standing there in the rain without an umbrella, without shoes, her arms wrapped so tightly around herself that her knuckles had turned white. Her lips were trembling, not from the cold alone, and her eyes carried a kind of emptiness I had never seen on her face before. She looked at me and said nothing for a long moment, and then in a voice so small it barely survived the distance between us, she whispered the words that would change everything. Hold me until morning. If this story moves something in you even before it truly begins, I want you to do something for me. Hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling me you believe in second chances. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still exists. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel, because stories like this one deserve to be seen by more hearts than just yours and mine. Now let's go back to where it all started. Her name was Elena, and she had been my best friend since the 4th grade, back when friendship was measured in shared lunches and secret handshakes rather than the harder currency of loyalty and sacrifice. We grew up 2 houses apart on a quiet street lined with maple trees, and for years our lives moved like 2 parallel rivers, close enough to hear each other but rarely touching, until something would pull us back together again. She was the girl who laughed too loud in movie theaters and cried during commercials about lost dogs. I was the quieter one, the one who noticed things, who remembered the small details other people forgot, like how she always ordered her coffee with extra cinnamon, or how she hummed old songs when she was nervous. By the time we reached our late 20s, life had scattered us in the way it does to almost everyone. I had thrown myself into work, chasing a promotion that always seemed to sit one step further away, while Elena had fallen in love with a man named Daniel, a man who wore expensive watches and spoke with the kind of confidence that made people trust him before they had any real reason to. She married him 2 years later in a small ceremony under string lights, and I stood beside her as her maid of honor, watching her eyes shine with a hope so pure it almost hurt to look at directly. I remember thinking that day that some people are simply built for happiness, that it follows them the way shadows follow everyone else. But happiness, I would learn, is rarely as loyal as it looks in wedding photographs. Over the following year, our phone calls grew shorter, and her laughter, when I did hear it, had a new edge to it, brittle and rehearsed, like something she was performing rather than feeling. I told myself it was just marriage, just the natural quieting that happens when 2 lives merge into one. I was busy climbing my own ladder, telling myself that being a good friend simply meant not intruding, meant trusting that she would come to me if something was wrong. That belief, I would later understand, was one of the most dangerous forms of self-protection, because it let me stay comfortable while she was slowly disappearing. It wasn't until her sister called me, her voice tight with worry, that I understood how far the distance between us had grown. She told me that Elena hadn't answered her phone in 3 days, that Daniel had stopped coming to family dinners, that something in the way Elena spoke lately felt rehearsed, like she was reciting lines to convince everyone, including herself, that she was fine. I remember sitting in my car outside my office, gripping the steering wheel, furious with myself for not noticing sooner, for letting distance become an excuse instead of a warning sign. That was the week before the knock on my door. I drove to her apartment that same night after the phone call, but no one answered, and the windows were dark in a way that felt deliberate. Daniel's car was gone. I stood on the sidewalk for almost 20 minutes, staring up at the dark windows, feeling a fear I couldn't yet name creeping into my chest. I texted her 3 times, called her 4, and finally left, telling myself she was probably just asleep, that I was overreacting, that adults were allowed to have quiet nights without it meaning catastrophe. I drove home with that thought sitting uneasily in my stomach, like a stone I couldn't quite swallow or spit out. 3 days later came the knock. When I opened the door and saw her standing there soaked in shaking, I felt something in me shatter and rebuild itself in the same instant. I didn't ask questions, I didn't demand explanations. I simply pulled her inside, wrapped her in the blanket from my couch, and held her the way you hold something fragile that has already been dropped once and cannot survive being dropped again. Her shivering wasn't only from the rain. It came from somewhere deeper, someplace inside her that had been cold for a long time, maybe longer than either of us wanted to admit. She didn't speak for almost an hour. I made tea neither of us drank, sat beside her on the floor with our backs against the couch, and waited. I had learned, somewhere in my life, that some silences should never be rushed, that people reveal their truths only when they feel safe enough to stop performing strength. Eventually, in a voice hollowed out by exhaustion, she began to speak. She told me about the nights Daniel would come home late, smelling like someone else's perfume, and how he would twist every question she asked into an accusation against her own sanity. She told me how he had slowly convinced her that she was too sensitive, too dramatic, too much, until she stopped trusting her own memory of events. She told me about the night before, when an argument had turned physical for the first time, his hand closing around her wrist hard enough to leave a bruise shaped like fear itself, and how she had waited until he fell asleep before slipping out the door with nothing but her keys and the clothes on her back. I remember feeling my own hands shake as she spoke, not from fear for myself, but from a helpless kind of rage, the kind that has nowhere productive to go except into resolve. I told her she was safe now, that she would never have to go back to that apartment if she didn't want to, that whatever she needed, I would help her find a way through it. She looked at me then with an expression I will never forget, gratitude tangled up with shame, as though she believed she didn't deserve the kindness being offered to her. That belief, I would learn over the following weeks, was the deepest wound of all, deeper than any bruise Daniel had left on her skin. That night, after she had cried until she had nothing left, she asked me the question that gave this story its title. She asked me to hold her until morning because she was afraid that if she woke up alone she would convince herself to go back, that the isolation Daniel had built around her would pull her back into its familiar shape, the way a rubber band always returns to its original form no matter how far you stretch it. So I held her. I stayed awake most of that night, feeling her breathing slowly steady beneath my arm, watching the dark window for the first hint of gray that would mean morning had finally arrived and she had survived the night without retreating into the danger she had just escaped. The weeks that followed were not easy, and I want to be honest about that, because healing rarely follows the neat timeline we wish it would. There were days when Elena barely spoke, when she sat by the window for hours staring at nothing in particular, and there were nights when she woke up crying from dreams she refused to describe. There were moments when Daniel called, his voice honeyed with apologies, promising he had changed, promising it would never happen again, and I watched her hand hover over the phone, torn between the life she had built and the safety she had just found. I never forced her decision. I simply stayed close, reminding her gently again and again that she deserved a life where love didn't require flinching. I helped her file a police report, sat beside her in a lawyer's office as she signed papers that would eventually end her marriage, and drove her to therapy appointments on days when she said she felt too tired to leave the couch. I watched her rebuild herself piece by piece, the way you might restore an old house, not by tearing everything down, but by carefully reinforcing what still stood and slowly replacing what had rotted beyond saving. There were setbacks. There was a night 3 months later when she nearly called Daniel back, convinced that loneliness was worse than fear, and I sat with her until 4 a.m., reminding her of every bruise, every apology that had turned into another excuse, until the urge passed and she fell asleep against my shoulder instead. Somewhere in that slow, difficult process, something shifted in me as well. I had spent years believing that being a good friend meant giving Elena space, meant not intruding on her life. I realized now that real friendship sometimes means refusing to look away, means showing up uninvited when your instincts tell you something is wrong, means choosing presence over politeness. I promised myself I would never again mistake distance for respect. Not with her, not with anyone I loved. 6 months after that rainy night, Elena got her own apartment for the first time in her adult life, small and imperfect, with a leaking faucet and mismatched furniture we had collected from thrift stores and second-hand listings. The day she got her keys, she stood in the empty living room and cried, not from sadness this time, but from something that looked almost like disbelief, as if she still couldn't quite trust that safety was allowed to feel this ordinary, this quiet. She turned to me and said that she used to think strength meant never needing anyone, that asking for help was a kind of failure. She said that night on my doorstep had taught her the opposite, that the bravest thing she had ever done was admit she couldn't survive the dark alone, and that reaching out had saved her life more surely than any illusion of independence ever could have. If you're still watching this story, if something in it has reached into your chest and touched a nerve you didn't expect, I want you to take a moment right now and let me know in the comments. Tell me if you have ever been the one shivering at someone's door, or if you have ever been the one who opened that door without hesitation. Your comment might be the very thing that reminds someone else, someone scrolling through this video at their own lowest point, that reaching out is not weakness, that somewhere out there someone would answer the knock. Elena is doing well today. She laughs the way she used to before Daniel, loud and unguarded, and she has started volunteering at a local shelter for women rebuilding their lives after abuse, saying she wants to be the door that opens for someone else the way mine opened for her. We still talk almost every day, though our conversations look different now, deeper somehow, stitched together by everything we survived that year. Sometimes she teases me about how stubborn I was that night, refusing to sleep, refusing to let go of her even when her breathing had long since steadied into something peaceful. I tell her I wasn't being stubborn. I was simply making sure that when morning came, she would still be there to see it. Before we close this story, I want to ask one more thing of you, gently, honestly. If this touched something in your heart, if it made you think of your own best friend, your own sister, your own quiet act of courage, or the courage of someone who once showed up for you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs it. Somewhere out there is a person shivering behind a closed door tonight, too afraid to knock, too ashamed to ask for help. And maybe, just maybe, this story reaching them at the right moment could be the difference between another lonely night and someone finally saying, yes, I will hold you until morning. Before you go, I want to ask you something important. Please comment below and tell me one word that describes what this story made you feel. It matters more than you know, both to me and to everyone else who will scroll past your words and find a little more hope because of them. Elena once told me that mornings used to terrify her, because morning meant facing another day inside a life that was slowly erasing her. Now, she says, mornings feel like proof. Proof that the night didn't win. Proof that somewhere in the middle of the darkest hours, someone chose to stay. And if there is one thing I hope you carry with you after watching this, it is this simple truth. Sometimes the most powerful thing you will ever do for another human being is nothing more and nothing less than holding on until the morning comes.